Hello, and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and issues in laser focused detail so that you build an accurate and informative big picture. So this week I have with me my fellow co-host Asim Islam to discuss the recent deal Pakistan signed with China's PIESAT Information Technology Company for a constellation of 20 imaging satellites with transfer of technology to eventually manufacture satellites domestically within Pakistan. This new satellite deal signals Pakistan's shift towards taking imaging intelligence, or IMINT, seriously, and in turn building a sovereign-controlled capability. It's interesting that it follows the formation of the Army's Rocket Force Command, or ARFC, which on the surface promises to give Pakistan an always ready preemptive strike option. Now, it seems that Pakistan is building the situational awareness net, first with a focus on persistent satellite imaging covering. Coverage. Note, this would only be one piece of the bigger picture. Pakistan also maintains other imaging assets, from the DB-110 equipped F-16s to ground-facing radars armed from drones and long-range special mission aircraft, and so on. Each one of these has its own ecosystem, and at a high level, they would need to interoperate with the other pieces to truly build real-time situational awareness. It's a low-key deal, but one with major implications. So I have with me Asim, an aerospace engineer based out of the United States. And as for myself, I'm the founder of Kua, based out of Canada. So without further ado, how are you, Asim?
Good. Let me just clarify one more thing. So my name is actually Asim, it's not Asim. So just for the listeners there. Some of the listeners were confused.
Perfect. So let's get into the main story here with regards to the PIESAT satellite deal. So just for some quick background, last month, Pakistan signed a $406 million deal with PIESAT for a constellation of 20 plus satellites that would, I quote, provide an integrated satellite system for real-time communication and remote sensing to Pakistan. So just for some context, or additional context rather, PIESAT focuses on remote sensing and imaging via interferometric synthetic aperture radars, or INSAR. So the INSAR-equipped satellites would use basically their radar arrays to take images of the surface, but INSAR, in particular, it involves several satellites taking images of the same area at different times. So the point is, to capture the images of an area to identify very subtle changes or shifts within that area, and that's done with, additional processing and other measures. So that's just like the core technical background. The deal apparently does include a provision to set up a satellite manufacturing facility within Pakistan, which would be an interesting subtopic as well, as we know that Pakistan had tried to develop such a thing through the Pakistan Space Center. And another interesting detail is that it mentioned both imaging, or rather remote sensing, and communication, but PIESAT in particular focuses on the imaging stuff. So it implies that this satellite manufacturing facility might be more broad-based, so maybe PIESAT isn't just providing transfer technology on a very singular focus, which is the imaging stuff. Maybe that would be proprietary technology. It might be more in terms of the know-how of how to build a satellite in general at scale, is what I'm imagining here. But anyways, Asim, over to you.
Yeah, so I was thinking that it would be worth, going into some detail into how a SAR works for our listeners, because it's a term thrown around a lot in defense spheres, but maybe it's not explained well enough. Let me just preface this by saying that I'm not an expert in this by a long shot. This is not my area of expertise. This is just something I know as a hobbyist, I guess. So with that preface out of the way, so let's just give a little background on how a synthetic aperture radar works. Now, what's an aperture? So people who are familiar with cameras might know that aperture is basically the size of the opening of the camera sensor, right? Basically, it's where the lens's light is being focused onto. That's the aperture. So the size of the aperture is important. Now, this is a basic fact of physics, that aperture size is related to the resolution of the image you can get and to the wavelength of whatever you are imaging. When I say wavelength, visible light is also a kind of radio wave which has a wavelength in nanometers. So the way the math works out is, for a camera and visible light, the aperture can be something as small as something you can fit into a camera, right? Something that can fit into your hand. Now, let's suppose you didn't want to use radio wave. So you didn't want to use visible light, which is in nanometers wavelength. You wanted to use radio waves instead because, reasons. The reasons will become obvious. Now, radio waves are the radio waves which we'll be using for SAR will typically have wavelengths in centimeters. A centimeter to 10 centimeters, so microwaves, X-band, whatever, right? Again, the math works out that for like a good enough resolution, the resolution here is in terms of angular resolution, right? So it isn't directly, in meters or anything like that. It's in angles, so arc seconds or degrees or divisions of degrees. So basically, the requirement of resolution, which is reasonable when you're using radio waves, becomes in kilometers. The aperture size requirement becomes in kilometers. And obviously, you cannot have a satellite or a radio dish that is, a kilometer long or 10 kilometers long. So there's two techniques that you can do. So the first technique is radar interferometry. So this is a technique where you use multiple sensors and you use the differences in how the radio waves reflect in different locations to combine the data from those images into a single image. This is how the black hole, the famous black hole picture that we saw a couple of years ago, that was imaged. So we had radio telescopes all across the planet, and the entire planet Earth acted as an aperture, right? So the Earth-sized aperture. So that's one thing. The other thing is you can also use, if you have a platform that is moving, so for example, you have an aircraft that is flying, or you have a satellite that is moving, you can also use that motion to basically back out or basically fake a larger aperture, kind of in the similar way. Now, older generation SAR satellites or SARs that were mounted on UAVs, this was a single moving platform, right? So for example, you would have a single drone that would fly across and it would act like an aperture, a larger aperture by a function of its movement through space, right? The new trend in things is because now sensors are so great and, satellites have become so advanced, you can actually do formation flying in satellites. So what you do instead is, just like the many, radio telescopes on Earth, you fly multiple satellites in orbit in formation, and you use the spread of those satellites to fake a giant aperture. It's a synthetic aperture radar, but the aperture for that system is based on multiple satellites. So if you, for example, you place the satellites 3 kilometers away in orbit, your aperture is now 3 kilometers wide. So you can get better resolution that way. Of course, you can't make these satellites for really far away from each other because they need to communicate with each other, and there are some physical limitations as well. But that's the basic gist of this. Now, there's like a very important advantage of doing this versus a single satellite. Now, with a single satellite, the speed at which you were moving determined the size of your aperture, right? And the speed was directly linked with your orbital design, right? So roughly speaking, when you're closer to the Earth, you're flying much faster. When you're further from the Earth, you're flying much slower in terms of orbital speed. And it's a complicated relationship between orbital speed, orbital altitude, right? Because you need ground images of a certain resolution. So it's a complicated, trade-off study that you need to do for a synthetic aperture radar that is on one satellite. But what if you had multiple satellites? Right now, what you can do is you control the size of the aperture. So in addition to the speed, you are primarily controlling it with the spread of your formation. This decouples the orbital speed from the resolution requirements or the aperture requirements of your satellite. So this allows you to, for example, maybe you want to move the satellites much closer to the Earth and, get better resolution, get better revisit times. So that's the trend in synthetic aperture radar satellites these days. And this is precisely what PIESAT is offering. So their solution is based on a formation flying constellation of satellites. So they use multiple satellites acting as one giant aperture. And because now their aperture is independent of orbital speed, they can place the orbit anywhere they want, right? So they can have more frequent revisits of Earth or a place on Earth, and that's their advantage, right? So they can probably use cheaper, smaller satellites that are closer to the Earth and are using probably, less expensive radar systems to get the same resolution that maybe 30 years ago you needed, hundreds of times more expensive systems for. Yeah, so that was a little spiel on, the technicality behind how SAR works.
Perfect. Thanks, Asim. So, now in terms of PIESAT's performance in terms of imaging, they don't provide too many details from their official website. They just basically note that they're able to reach 0.5 meters in terms of resolution. However, Chinese media, they did like a bit of an expose or profile of the company a year ago. And basically, PIESAT had told them or indicated to them that with a constellation of 54 satellites, now this is a pretty key number, they would be able to achieve globally a revisit rate, so that's the rate at which new images of an area can be taken, of up to 60 minutes or an hour. So that's with 54 satellites, apparently claiming that they can get a revisit rate of about 60 minutes globally. Now, where it gets interesting for Pakistan is that Pakistan's committing to at least 20 satellites. So phase 1 involves 20 satellites. So that would be based on how they've grouped their systems, basically 5 formations essentially, which stands to reason that at least within the immediate regional vicinity of Pakistan and like the surrounding environment, like India, Afghanistan, maybe the Arabian Sea to an extent, they're definitely aiming for a revisit rate that's well under 1 day. Now I don't want to go too far and say it would reach an hour necessarily, but it sounds like from an intent standpoint, that's what they want to get to, and that I think it's a very critical indicator because just a couple of weeks ago we were discussing the Army Rocket Force Command and really wondering how serious it would be, because for something like the ARFC to really matter doctrinally and to be a credible threat, it would need two things, right? It would need, number one, a large magazine in terms of munition stockpiles. We don't have any clear indications that they're pursuing that just yet, but it might be down the line because they've actually just solved the first piece, right, which is the near real-time imaging, or rather near real-time situational awareness net that they would need to identify targets, track targets. So for example, just to give an example situation, right, I believe that, in the waning hours of the recent conflict with India during their ceasefire talks, the Indians indicated that Pakistan had information on some vectors or attack elements that India was mobilizing, and Pakistan, told India that, hey, we're aware of those vectors. And I think the point that we had surmised was that Pakistan would have wished it had the capability to both identify those vectors itself and then to strike them preemptively, as opposed to telling India, hey, we know about those vectors, better watch out. Right, and then that can get misconstrued as basically the way the Indians sort of construed it and presented it to the media was that Pakistan was begging India to stop using those vectors, unfortunately, for Pakistan's side. So I think what the Pakistan side would have preferred was that, hey, we saw these vectors being mobilized, we saw some TEL movements happening by the hour, by every 2 hours. We tracked their air defense movements, we tracked their aircraft movements, we tracked them going from base to base, whatever. We used that information, we sent that information up to our Fatah 1, Fatah 2, Fatah 4, maybe some Chinese, CM302 launchers, and we attacked them. And I think this purchase of the PIESAT constellation system with a plan to constantly revitalize it as the older satellites, wane out during the result of their shorter life cycles is a very clear sign that this whole ARFC thing could be pretty serious.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to talk about this more. But let me just say one tiny thing about orbital design. So the design of orbits is I'd like to say an art because there are so many constraints that it's, each orbit for a constellation is designed, right? So when I say design, it's just like a person sitting there doing lots of, math, trying to see what works, what doesn't. It's not like a formula that you apply and you get an answer right away, right? So let me just emphasize that being able to use a formation of satellites for SAR reduces one constraint that you had on orbital speed. Now, Pakistan said that we're doing 20 satellites. That means 5, basically 5. Think of this as 5 satellites. Now, I strongly suspect and there's a user question on this as well, that these are low Earth orbit satellites. So they've because they're not restricted by the speed of the satellite, PIESAT has chosen to move their satellites closer to the Earth, and that allows them to do revisits that are much faster. And then so it really depends on how Pakistan is planning to perhaps expand this 20 number or not. So they could, for example, send out these satellites in orbit so that maybe you get revisits every 30 minutes only for a part of the day, and then you have a blackout time for 12 hours or something. Or they could maybe spread out their revisits throughout the entire day. Right? So these are all design decisions that we will probably never know of. But keep in mind that these are things that you can now do because you're not restricted. You have one less constraint. So this is something that would, be very interesting for me, especially as an aerospace engineer. Unfortunately, this is something that is going to be super classified. But keep in mind that, I bet these satellites, once you expand these to a constellation of 50 or something, these will easily get revisit times of 30 minutes or something like that. It won't be that hard because these are flying much closer to the Earth because of the reason that I described earlier. Now, with regards to ARFC, so if you look at the MOU and the agreement that was signed, the agreement was between PIESAT and the Ministry of Food Security and Research.
Yeah, that's very funny.
So, I don't think anyone believes that the Ministry of Food Security has
Done their research.
Pakistan's best, yeah, and Pakistan's best satellite network is with the Ministry of Food Security.
Hey, maybe the farmers are putting up the money for their needs.
Or that, or that. So, I'm very sure that this is an ARFC or basically a military requirement.
Absolutely. And I think, so I would also add this. It's like, we should not be confused in the sense, not confused rather, we should not assume that this capability is necessarily tied to Pakistan's constellation. I think the underlying story as well is that China has released a very sensitive dual use technology platform to Pakistan, right? That's like the real big story here. Because before, Pakistan would basically have to talk to the Chinese in order to get those imageries, the imaging sensor, sorry, the images basically. There is a bit of a potential lag time or some sort of friction layer that would have to be negotiated. This basically, I assume, will remove the friction layer, and it would happen pretty soon, even before the satellites or the Pakistani satellites come into orbit. So what I mean is the company PIESAT could potentially fast track, the construction of ground stations, downlink processing centers, and all that kind of stuff within Pakistan pretty soon, so that Pakistan can at least use their Chinese their NUA constellation right away, and that would immediately remove the friction layer. Because the whole point is that if China is willing to approve the transfer of a constellation and then also the TOT for manufacturing them in Pakistan and also the ground support, also the software. The deal also includes transfer technology in terms of understanding how to develop the software for this. It's basically a full stack transfer, meaning that, okay, like you can get the thing of your own. That implicit assumption is that you can also start using the thing that already exists sooner. So it would be a wrong assumption to assume that, hey, because, the next India-Pakistan conflict could happen, in months to a year or two, who knows, right? So I think the capability has basically been greenlit, and I think we'll probably see Pakistan Space Command or something talk about, hey, we have these fast revisit rates now and blah 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 because we set up the ground stations for it. And it's not unprecedented. Like, we know that Pakistan has its own like long-term, sovereign controlled navigation system in the roadmap. Obviously, that's nowhere on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. However, they were able to set up basically relays, special relays that would connect the SBAS system, basically, that would connect to the Chinese Beidou system. So that would allow the Pakistan military to natively connect to Beidou and use that for all their purposes, basically. So I think also the capability is going to come up pretty soon. I think, and I also want to get Asim your thoughts on one other thing we noticed here. that it wasn't SUPARCO that signed the deal. So the previous satellites, like the PRSC series, it was SUPARCO that was, the primary buyer, so to speak, right? And now it's been given to the Ministry of National Food Security and Research. I think this is an indication that any future seems like, we kind of hinted towards this earlier. We inferred based on the SUPARCO budget cuts that space development or space procurement is being decoupled from SUPARCO, basically. Is that what you see as well?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, that was very interesting, right? Because a satellite deal for constellation and SUPARCO was nowhere to be seen. So I think this was very key. As we've discussed this earlier, SUPARCO has several problems, right? Because it was taken under the military, it's under the SPD, so it is basically sanctioned, so it cannot do any kind of business with anyone in the world. It cannot import anything. It basically functions as an extension of Pakistan's SPD organization, right? So maybe this is an indication that Pakistan has decided to cut its losses, move satellite manufacturing and the actual space program work to somewhere else. Now, there's an interesting line in the agreement. So, PIESAT will also provide technical support to Pakistan to help Pakistan develop independent capabilities in satellite manufacturing operations and applications. Now, this is basically like saying that PIESAT is being asked to set up a space program in Pakistan, right? So, I know setting up a space program is a huge thing. But I'm just saying that it feels like that maybe a separate, a civilian focused organization may be, started in Pakistan that will be, jump started using PIESAT's technology, right? And we need to, see that if you read the agreement, PIESAT is providing a turnkey solution that is end to end. They're supposed to provide the satellites, the ground stations, the software, everything basically. So this would be a great starting point, if you were to start a new organization. Because if you were starting, or if, for example, SUPARCO was buying these satellites, those satellites would, need to communicate with, SUPARCO's ground station and, integrate with their systems and whatnot. But what this agreement is an entirely new ecosystem that is being imported and, planted into Pakistan. So, I really think this is like supposed to be independent of SUPARCO. But again, this is just our speculation based on the peculiar absence of SUPARCO from the signing of this MOU.
Yeah, so I agree with you, but I looked at it in the reverse. The way I kind of interpreted was that they are basically gradually shifting SUPARCO back to its civilian roots, and more specifically in terms of space research, because they've been taking on like different space related research programs like the lunar probe and all this kind of stuff. So more experimental, more scientific, more abstractive, or rather more in terms of civilian applications and that kind of thing. And that would necessitate them being more open in order to do those projects, in order to have those engagements. And basically what's going to happen is that a new entity is being set up to specifically manage dual use technology, right? So in this case it would be like the satellite stuff. So, even PIESAT, despite it being a commercial entity and stuff, has to follow China's dual use, security controls and stuff. I don't think this will be the first time Pakistan requested such a system. I do imagine that they had probably asked for this kind of capability from China in earlier years, but it was never released to them until now. So the way I sort of perceive it is that there could be a new SPD entity that PIESAT is basically directly going to feed into to help build this overall capability. And it might be run differently, or maybe a little differently, because it has to work with the Chinese government to secure the technology and to update it and stuff. But I feel like SUPARCO itself is basically might be given, like, its leash might be cut in the long run in terms of like it's being decoupled away from the the space development or the space procurement stuff, and it's being more, allowed to just become an application layer, basically. Just do it, just do your thing, just become a user.
I actually think that because of this agreement being signed with the Ministry of National Food Security and Research, whatever this PIESAT or organization is spun up into is not going to be under SPD. I mean, if we're intelligent about it, it should not be under SPD, because being under SPD is what gets you the sanctions and the restrictions and not being able to do business with the rest of the world. So I take the signing of the agreement with the Ministry of Food Security as a positive indication that this will not be under SPD.
Okay, I can see that. I can see that. And then basically everybody else, like from SUPARCO, Air Force, Army, Navy, they become end users, so they have to go through a certain process of becoming end users. So I think where that then sends us into is that the ecosystem for this would have to be incredibly robust, right? We're getting into like for this to work well, we're such that where the Army and Navy and Air Force can use it as, subscribers basically, is that this new entity is going to need to get really good in terms of things like building the ground stations, building the software, even like things like API kits and all the and developer toolkits, because Army Rocket Force Command is going to need to build mission planning platforms basically that would have to tie into this. So this new entity, I think, would be then a really interesting, setup if it's going to take on all that work. So, okay, yeah. So one other point, and I think it's another interesting detail as well, is that people will have noticed that hey, like China secured yet another big ticket deal from Pakistan, and this time it's for satellites. And to be honest, I don't think it's surprising because at the end of the day, something like and we touched upon this a little earlier, something like image intelligence or imaging intelligence is probably far too sensitive for other Western vendors to sell to Pakistan, especially at the revisit and other performance parameters that Pakistan could be requiring. And also, many of the Western vendors also have an innate incentive to control the imaging intelligence pipeline a bit more so that you become more of a subscriber to their services and you have to sort of, operate on their terms, which is one of the reasons why Pakistan wanted to build sovereign control capabilities. So, in terms of the core satellite at the top level, literal top level, I don't think there was much prospect or many prospects for Western companies to come in, or even Turkish companies to come in and provide that solution to Pakistan, just due to the sensitive nature of it. So that should not be surprising because number one, China has been willing to provide that sensitive technology to Pakistan. Obviously this had to be approved from the Chinese government as well. It's a dual use technology platform. That being said, even within this context, as we just touched upon earlier, for Pakistan to really get maximum utilization out of the PIESAT constellation, it would need to build a very vast ecosystem of like space support assets. Now, this would include everything from your downlink ground stations, your processing platforms, your software platforms, and all the other connective tissues and layers necessary to really use this for operational purposes. And this is where those role specific companies from places like Turkey, from Italy, from the UK, from Spain, and many other places are going to have a big opportunity. And you're probably going to see their activity there in this layer the most. Because number one, the stuff that they would be marketing is pretty niche, very specific, not easily noticeable, not, flashy. Like, imagine the news report of Airbus selling a satellite to Pakistan, right? It would get all over. It'll be a global news story, right? However, something like a very specific support in developing a certain type of application, or transferring certain types of software defined radios for the communication layer, or helping the Pakistan Air Force's Space Command build new human machine interfaces and simulation systems, like all that kind of stuff has to be sourced and developed. And obviously the Pakistani industry will also play a very big role in all these areas, but I would actually say that, by having China involved in at least providing the central node, like the satellites, you have created an entirely new sub industry or sub market within Pakistan that'll be open to pretty much everybody, is what I think. So I think it's going to be a pretty exciting area. Obviously, the nature of the technology and stuff, it's going to mean that the stuff will be relatively classified and we won't know too much about it. But I think for the defense industry, it's going to be a really exciting opportunity because space has not traditionally been a major area for the Pakistani military, and suddenly it's like air defense is becoming this other, not service arm, but it's becoming this organized structure that's pretty big and affects all of the other tri-surfaces basically.
And let me just say one thing that, we may have, overlooked because we're a defense podcast, is that these satellites might actually have an actual legitimate use for agriculture. These satellites would be great for predicting, floods and stuff, right? So these do have an application besides, defense and stuff. And it basically adds to, my point that these organizations should be delinked from the SPD and Pakistan's military. And the reason for that is what you said as well, that Western vendors will have an easier time dealing with an organization that is not linked with Pakistan's military. Like even countries like Turkey, they do not like, their companies do not like to deal with, SPD organizations, because if they do, they're going to get sanctioned by the US, right? So they're also hesitant in doing that. So if you have an organization they know has a clean slate, to speak, as as we say, it would be much, easier for, Airbus or Aselsan or Turkish Airspace or whatever to, do business with this organization. Yeah.
Absolutely. The other part of it is that, if you want to understand how this would work from, how the defense apparatus would use they would become end users. So basically, they will not, as Asim alluded to, manage the satellites, the production, or even like, the constellation layers. Like they'll basically be abstracted away from that. And they would actually, like, imagine the way the Pakistan military had been using Western or Chinese imaging services. Now they'll just pivot to using a Pakistani imaging service, basically, right? And this imaging service provider, this company, will basically be more civilian oriented, more commercial oriented. However, obviously, it will provide controlled software connections to the Pakistan military if they require it, and obviously that'll happen. However, otherwise, I think, and I agree with Asim, that they will basically manage this as like a, as an independent entity that hopefully would not get tainted by the by SPD organizations. Obviously, there is that risk that could happen. This is Pakistan after all, but I think given that this deal is being signed under this current, let's say, leadership establishment with all its faults or benefits, whatever you might think, they are probably the most controlling, bureaucratic, restrictive entity that we could imagine at the moment. So in that sense, if they are organizing the satellite program along these lines, and I assume anyone else down the line will probably respect that, because it's just like, this is as tough as it is going to get. And if they realize these issues, then that's probably a pretty good sign from an optimal efficiency standpoint. So Asim, I think that will wrap up our main topic. So we can go towards our readers submitted questions, if that's cool with you.
Yeah, sounds good. These are very interesting questions we got this time.
Yeah. So the first question is, what kind of capabilities is Pakistan looking to get via its space program?
Okay, so the obvious thing is image intelligence, right? So that's what everyone talks about. But there's one thing that is very crucial that we'll get, and that is detailed terrain maps, which are useful for cruise missiles. So as you know, cruise missiles fly really close to the ground, and the better the terrain maps are, the closer the missile can fly, and the less chance of it is of the cruise missile being detected by the enemy radar. The United States probably has very detailed maps of the entire planet, right, of very high resolution, and that allows their cruise missiles to fly really close to the ground. And Pakistan does not have those maps yet. And that function of that is that our cruise missiles cannot fly as close to the ground as, let's say, a Tomahawk, right? So I'm pretty sure that with these satellites, we're going to get very, very detailed maps of the terrain of Pakistan and India. And that will allow, our scientists to really fine tune the guidance algorithms on our cruise missiles and, make them fly much closer to the ground and be much more stealthy. Another thing is, when you have very detailed maps, your cruise missiles can be super accurate in the absence of GPS, right? So as we know, GPS is notoriously easy to jam, right? So once you have very detailed maps, you can do terrain mapping, and there's a whole science to that. Dismag, Turcom, all that stuff. So when you have detailed maps, the kinds of maps that you can get from a constellation of SAR satellites, this is going to do wonders for your cruise missile program. So I think this is like a really great question that, made me think about this thing.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many different angles to this question as well. I mean, the one area I keep sort of focusing on as of late is how this would feed into the ARFC stuff. So basically, your satellite-based imagery would be one piece of a wider puzzle that you can start collating with your electronic intelligence, even your drone or fighter equipped sensors. So for example, you have F-16s, which are equipped with the DB-110 photo reconnaissance pod. You have drones, which are also equipped with synthetic aperture radars, which are ground facing. You also have your long range maritime patrol aircraft with SAR sensors as well. So you have all these different sensors collecting information, right? And the thing is, now you have actual capacity to see things visually at a more, broader, wider level. So, you can have the Pakistan Army or armed forces, for example, literally track the movement of India's S maneuvers, right? Like where they're putting the radars, where are they putting them, what are the habits, what are the trends that they use, what are the patterns that the Indian armed forces seem to be operating with. You might even try to spot we might spend some time trying to spot the differences between fake systems and real ones, right? And all this information goes in. And then, for example, let's say you detect, or let's say your satellites pick up a potential S-400 radar in some area. You take it back to your electronic intelligence people, your ELINT people. They can cross-verify to see if they picked up any emissions that could, suggest that there's an S-400 there. And suddenly you mark that area as, okay, this is a probable area that India will probably deploy a radar in a conflict, or maybe move it to somewhere else. So there's so many different things. So you have this entire school, and this is where you get those people who the whole open source intelligence community, but then you also have your geo intelligence community. So this, I think, would also open up a whole field within each of the service arms, the Pakistan Army, Navy, Air Force, of geo intelligence officers who really have to spend time looking at this stuff and to build those trend lines. And that would be probably a very interesting line of work as well, because it'll open up the armed forces to a different school of people who can also contribute towards the wider culture as well, as opposed to just being purely platform system centric, machine centric people. You'll also have more people who are more focused on spotting the bigger picture, the patterns, and that kind of thing. And then you have a whole cyber security element coming into this to secure this data. You have a whole, software development entity coming into this. And that's where I kind of touched back to one of our earlier episodes where Asim and I were basically saying that it would be really ideal for an entity like NASTAP to get into software and cybersecurity and AI, as opposed to trying to get into the hardware stuff, because NESCOM's already doing that. I think the big opportunity is, you're already so close, like literally your officers are in civilian environments. You should leverage that to your advantage and sort of leverage the civilian talent pool a bit more to get the most out of these systems. Because at the end of the day, like PIESAT is fundamentally a civilian company as well, right? And this new entity within Pakistan will also be a civilian entity, we hope. So it'd be good to start connecting into that more organically. So there's so many examples of how this is going to be used. Even the Navy is going to be using it as well, for different purposes. So there's no shortage of capabilities with this. One thing I'd add, though, is what's interesting is that this deal didn't speak to any satellite communication stuff. So it did say that the goal is to give Pakistan the means to independently manufacture and support satellite operations, and also to provide both the sovereign controlled imaging or remote sensing and a communications layer. But PIESAT doesn't work on communication satellites. So this can indicate that Pakistan is now moving towards building dedicated military or dedicated satellite communications capabilities. Maybe a dedicated military communication satellite, so that can we can maybe cut the bandwidth, not cut the bandwidth, rather lighten the bandwidth load on SUPARCO's more civilian oriented communication satellites. So again, with more and more, applications linking into SATCOM, like you have your drones, your long-range maritime patrol aircraft, you have your naval warships, you obviously have, the Pakistan Air Force's special mission aircraft, and so many others relying on SATCOM, that this is going to be, I think, an area that the armed forces will start exploring as well, and will start, looking for satellite vendors to help them build and design SATCOM applications, basically. So the next question, can you let us know the orbital altitude of satellites?
So I suspect this question is about the PIESAT constellation, not satellites in general. They obviously do not provide the data, but based on my understanding of what kind of system this is, I strongly suspect that this is a low Earth orbit constellation. And what that means is the orbital altitude is 250 to 400 kilometers, something like that. And that's basically because what I said earlier, formation flying allows your SAR satellite to be independent of your orbital speed. So you basically want to fly as close to the ground as possible.
Perfect. Next episode. Question. Can this agreement with China's PIESAT also help Pakistan with SLV or satellite launch vehicle capabilities? No, because PIESAT specifically coming into focus on the design, development, and manufacturing of imaging satellites and maybe satellites more generally, like communication satellites. So this is more focused on just the satellites themselves. The challenge with the SLV program is that only because it's run by an SBD organization, but the issue is that just the nature of the technology itself is easily construed as dual use, and the US has inserted a lot of heavy sanctions on Pakistan's, rocket programs that prevent it from really pushing hard on indigenous SLV technology. Obviously, that is in development, and they've been working at it, but it's just going to be difficult under the current sanctions regime to get it up and running soon. Maybe, it'll probably happen eventually as they start scaling out, and when they start when they have a requirement of launching multiple satellites per year, they might find that'll be more economical to do it within Pakistan. But at the currently, they're going to be relying on China, basically. Next question. Why does Pakistan need a space agency? Satellites in commercial, domestic, or defense. Pakistan is going well all these years without space agency programs. In defense, it is already comfortable with radio frequency systems like Data Link 17 for communication, which has a range of up to 250 nautical miles. Pakistan's maximum depth, it's itself not 250 nautical miles. Even for naval purposes, it doesn't voyage beyond 150 nautical miles in peacetime except for exercises. Then why are these space programs needed?
I mean, the easy answer to that is you're only talking about you're imagining that you only need to target systems inside Pakistan, but your enemy is India, right? India is huge. Your systems do not, see everything inside of India. The only thing you can see inside of India is if anything flies, then you can see it with your AWACS aircraft. But you need persistent, intelligence of targets in India. You need persistent intelligence on their ships, for example, where their aircraft carriers are, where their ships are, so you can direct maybe your, submarines from your navy, or you can, target, those systems with rockets from ARFC. So, and for example, right now you're possibly relying, or you're definitely relying on Chinese systems. For some reason or the other, if they're unavailable, you need systems of your own. So maybe you need your cruise missiles to be able to operate in the GPS denied environment, right? Right now, they can't really do that. But, with a successful space program, you'll have detailed terrain maps of, importantly, India, right? And that will let you do important things inside of India. And there's communication needs as well, right? So like you said, the question said data link, 17 has some range, but it's a very low data rate communication system. So for example, you cannot use it to, it does not have the speed, or it has some latency when it comes to, doing real-time targeting and stuff like that. So if you had dedicated communication nodes based on satellites and SATCOMs, you could seamlessly, manage a battle net that consists of drones, cruise missiles, and all these systems, and even air-to-air missiles that are communicating at real-time speeds. Data Link 17 is a system that was good for a time, and we've done an episode on that. But for contemporary needs, and especially for the future, Link 17 is not enough.
Exactly, and that sort of bleeds into the next question. Is like, if Pakistan needs all these space assets, China's next door. But the issue is, when you work with any other country, whether it's a close partner like China or someone else, there's always a friction layer, right? You have to basically access that data and information on their terms. So there can be a theoretical situation where China will not be comfortable with providing you that information because it could actually harm their interests. Imagine, how willing are the Chinese to be, let me reframe the question. Are the Chinese that willing to be implicated in a big controversy involving Pakistan and India? At some level, yes, right? Maybe when it comes down to shooting down a couple of Rafales, okay, fine, right? That's in the big scheme of things, that doesn't harm anyone except for the pilots involved, right? However, at a deep and more strategic level, does China want to get implicated with Pakistan launching long-range missile strikes that might hit a critical Indian military installation that could spur escalation issue? Not necessarily, right? So in those contexts, China might not provide the information. I mean, people will say, well, China's a close friend and partner. At the end of the day, every country is out for its own survival, right? So there are always going to be red lines. And the fact is because those red lines exist, that Pakistan is requesting and has been able to get this technology. So China is willing to go part way. It's willing to go up to a point where it says, okay, look, we cannot directly feed information to you. However, you buy these assets and these systems and you run them independently, and then so we'll help you up to the part of providing you the capacity, and then we are not going to be implicated in how you manage that capacity, right? And that's fine. Like that's a good agreement. It's a commercial transaction. So that's another reason why you don't want to over rely on any one partner.
Yeah. So that's a very good point. And just to add to the list of frictions. So when we say that China is right next door and provides everything to us, we're sort of, not thinking about how are they providing this data. Do we really think that they've come in and installed terminals in all of our systems that, say information from China and that links to our C4I system? That's probably not it, right? I mean, there are security reasons, and we don't want, Chinese systems being integrated into our C4I net. So when we say, or when the Indians said that, the Pakistanis had information about Indian vectors, this was being provided over, telephone lines or, or something like that. This wasn't real-time, targeting level-based data. So just because China can't provide you that information, it doesn't mean, your systems are going to be a well-oiled machine working with that data. So you do need data in your own system that you acquire on your own to reduce the latency that, comes from getting data from, China, for example. And the question said GPS coordinates for ballistic missiles are given by USA. So I think that's a little disingenuous because a GPS is like an open source thing. So they aren't given, but GPS is notoriously easy to jam, right? In Ukraine, they stopped using GPS guided, artillery shells because they were jammed so often that they were basically, useless. So it's very, GPS, or I shouldn't say just GPS. Any kind of GNSS signal is extremely easy to jam. It's a very low power signal and you can jam it in a very large area with very low effort. So the trend now is to have every system that you have be GNSS independent. So that's going to be an very important thing going into the future.
Exactly. And even in terms of GNSS, it has its uses, but even in that context, Pakistan does have a long-term vision of building sovereign control capabilities for that as well. So in 2021, they commissioned a feasibility study in developing a national satellite navigation location services platform. Again, essentially their own GNSS. Huge, a very big ambition, certainly. And definitely not on the near-term horizon, right? But this PIESAT deal, it implicitly suggests that this is a big step towards that, right? So you have a civilian-oriented commercial space manufacturing center within Pakistan that's not just going to focus on imaging satellites, but also communication satellites. And it stands to reason that it'll eventually transfer over into also focusing on navigation and services satellites. So that, even from that standpoint, despite being able to access Beidou at a pretty close level through the SBAS architecture, Pakistan is still thinking about what has to happen next for that sovereign control capability. And that goes into Asim's point, is that, how number one is how willing are the Chinese, in terms of getting implicated into stuff? Like, what's their threshold for that? And when are they going to say, when are they going to lose patience with us? And number two is like, how deeply can we integrate those interface systems into our architecture without compromising our own security or even that of China's security? It goes both ways, right? So these things you have to have sovereign controlled space capabilities. Now, that being said, one area where I think China is going to provide a lot of valuable guidance is in the job of not only just setting this up, but integrating it. Because if this all materializes, right, Pakistan will be one of a handful of countries in the world with sovereign controlled imaging capabilities at this scale, right? And as I noted earlier, this requires a huge ecosystem of systems to basically feed into and support and to fully leverage. And this is where China will come in and provide guidance on how to build that architecture the right way. Because you're kind of getting in this one area, you're elevating yourself into a pretty big domain. Like for context, none of the Gulf countries have this capability, right, natively. I'm not sure if Iran has this capability natively, right? Turkey's building towards it as well. So you are going to be in a handful of countries. So I think that's where, the way you want to look at Chinese collaboration in the ideal way is not in terms of specific tactical stuff, right? That stuff is like, the ROI on it is so low for both sides. Like, Chinese are going to take all the risk by giving Pakistan targeting information, which can be used in any which way. And then likewise, Pakistan has to deal with the friction layers of, whether Chinese want to provide that information or not. No, but when it comes to the big picture stuff where, how do you industrialize like a China, right? How do you organize your broad military industrial, plans like China? How do you manage your space program like a China, right? That's the conversations we should be having with the Chinese. And that is, that'll help us build our own sort of system independently and to our own requirements and realities better. And then that'll help us get better outcomes in the end. So next question. What effect will the decoupling of the dual-use space program have on Pakistan's commercial space research, be it good or bad?
I think we covered this in a lot of detail already, but roughly speaking, this is very good for Pakistan, and it is something that has been holding back Pakistan's space program for a very long time.
Perfect. So we'll conclude it there. And just a note, we will be changing things up a bit by posting 2 shorter episodes per week. One focus on a Pakistan defense news story specifically, and the other one on other countries like such as India, Turkey, and China, and from the context of how they would affect Pakistan. So they're both still technically Pakistan related, but one is more in terms of what's happening inside, and the other is in terms of what's happening outside that could affect Pakistan. So our next episode will air in a few days after this one. So once again, thank you, Asim, for joining me this episode. I also thank our listeners for tuning in, and of course, as usual, we'll be teasing our new episodes every couple days ahead of recording. So if you'd like to send us a question, just subscribe to our channel at Kuwa Group, and we'll be sure to get it up online. So see you all again. Bye.